So hello everyone. Welcome to How to Protect Your Project from Start to Finish. This is part 4, Project Communication. This is a Clear on Black webcast. I'm Carl Ross, President and CEO. We are a bespoke interior architectural firm specializing in upscale luxury hotels and resorts. We help owners, operators, and developers gain dominating market presence and greater profitability by unlocking the hidden potential of their properties. Clear on Black webcasts cover hospitality design topics that affect owners, operators, developers, as well as architects and purchasing agents and other allied hospitality team members. I and the occasional guest expert speak for about 30 minutes and then take your questions for a few more. So these webinars came about, this particular series came about as kind of a series of best practices, a collection. And our mission is to elevate the process of hotel and resort design and how it's done. So when I look at across the arc of what projects are and the areas for incremental change, we've kind of seen some interesting evolutions. We've been on projects that have been just extraordinary and have been really remarkable, and then we've been on things that are just flat, not really getting it done. So what we wanted to do is pull together these best practices and put them forward, and that's what this collection is. So today's agenda is really we're gonna jump to this. Let's see here. Forgive me. All right, there we go. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to cover the recap of the project control palette. Secondly, we're going to cover the types of project communication. We're going to evaluate your system. We're going to talk about evaluating your system. Then we're going to have over and under communicating. Then we're going to have 2 key meeting types. And then team characteristics that derail communication. So when we look at the project control palette and the recap, this is what we've covered in the first 3 webinars. The overview, we determined the scope and the purpose of the project, and that some of these seem so tremendously fundamental, yet so oftentimes we see them missed. So what is the scope of the project? And very importantly, what is the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? So next, conditions of satisfaction. So conditions of satisfaction are the pieces that the team decides this is what we're going to have. These are the elements and the pieces that we want to be able to achieve. These are the things that are going to make this project worthwhile, and they're not just fundamental things such as, yeah, we want to make money, but there are other elements. Then we have the big 3, of course: cost, time, and quality, and how those interrelate to each other, how those become primary drivers of what the focus of the project is. Then we have the SMART goals, and that's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed. And then we covered the differentiation document, how important that is, who's doing what, when, and where on the project, the budget responsibilities, the deliverables responsibilities, all of that. Then we have project schedule, how that works in and how that's an important piece of that whole project arc. Then we have project budget development. And project budget development, we talked about that last time, and what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create a palette of tools that as we move forward on projects, and as the owners and operators and developers on this call look at, how do you best control a project so you achieve the best outcome that you possibly can and you mitigate your risk, and we talked about that as well. So when we look at communication, I've long been a fan of communication in all kinds of forms, and that seems like such a trite and trivial thing, like, well, sure, you know, we've got to be able to communicate to get things done. But I think there's an interesting element of legacy, and that is what you learn and where you learn it, and what that means to you. And so I've researched, I've read the standard business stuff, I've done things, and I look at in what arenas is communication really, really, truly important? How critical is it? How fundamental is it to achieving results? And I think, you know, communication is designed as talking and conveying information. So it's defined as the imparting or exchanging of information or news. Well, okay, that's great, but it's only valuable if it can be processed. So when we look at the various arenas that communication is truly, truly important, one that I found to be absolutely shocking is this one, 9/11. So fact, several U.S. intelligence agencies had information that might have implied that the 9/11 attack was about to occur, but they were not able to process that mountain of data in time to act. And that comes from Lieutenant Commander John Cannon of the U.S. Navy SEALs in his book, Leadership Lessons of the Navy SEALs. So obviously, that is the empirical limit of importance of data and information transfer and communication. And I dare say there's nobody on this call that is of that primary actioning level. But this is about creating a sense of importance about what we do. So when we look at the communication types, I want to focus on what we have. There's basically two types. The first is and think about this in your professional life in the context of that. Unfiltered, narrative, and opinion-based. Well, that's okay. You got to remember some interesting parts of that, though, because there are times when unfiltered, narrative, opinion-based stuff is okay, but there are times when it's also got to be filtered. It needs to be composed. It needs to be politically sensitive. There is a maxim that is what we call the LA Times maxim, and that is in the context of, let's say, transmission of an email, an exchange of email, I would say that I wouldn't put anything in an email that I wouldn't be willing to read in the LA Times. And when you use that filter, all of a sudden things start to trim down pretty quickly. I'm certainly not seeking headlines like that. So I think as a filter and as a guide, that maxim is pretty sobering, and I think it's very valuable. So the fundamental question is, what information gets shared? And again, we're talking about at the project level. Well, anything which impacts the big three. That's going to be anything having to do with the budget, anything that impacts the schedule, causes a deviation. It can be something that is related to quality. There's a specification change. There could be an installation issue. Any of those things need to be communicated. But also, expectations. Expectations are critical to be shared, because it's not only just setting the expectation, it's expressing and getting agreement to those, and then maintaining those expectations. And I think a lot of the important kind of hiccups on projects and some of the frustrations that we've all felt have been around either unknown expectations, non-expressed expectations, or somebody not following up on what those are. So those elements and expectation pieces, those things absolutely have to be shared, and that's kind of ongoing, and as well as the big three. And those kind of the big three and the expectations, I think, cover virtually everything under the umbrella of project. So the next piece we have is the communication traffic, and really we want to have a decision-making protocol to identify the decision makers on the client and operations side. So there's a single and final decision maker, but we have to encourage communicators to control who they talk to, who they communicate to. Suggestion: review email addresses before you send stuff out. Encourage people to ask to be taken off the CC list if they're no longer relevant, and that is if the individual's participation in the project isn't relevant, something, their domain, their discipline has been answered, or they're no longer needed for feedback or to weigh in on something. There are elements too that when I see a subject line that says FYI, I don't know if that is for your inconvenience, or because usually nothing else is ever said, and it's like, FYI, what action am I supposed to take on this? So that and maybe it should be FYA for your annoyance, I'm not sure. But what I do know is this, is that too many decision makers and too many masters doesn't work. Communication from multiple stakeholders confuses and misdirects the team. If there are 7 decision makers or 7 masters communicating with the principal designer or the principal architect, who are we supposed to listen to? Who's got the final say? So that's why having a decision-making protocol in place to identify the decision makers on the client and ops side, and there needs to be a single final decision maker. That person's tasked with coalescing every single piece of information outside of the design realm prior to disseminating it into the design realm. So I want to talk about evaluating your system. Well, systems are interesting because there's the ad hoc system. That is siloed. Everybody's got their own place, their own information. It is primarily driven by a flood of email with disconnected threads or epic long threads and a series of obligatory weekly conference calls. That is a tremendous preponderance of what we see in the industry. And it's kind of like, I'm giving us all a pass, all a buy on this, because maybe we didn't know any better and maybe we don't know that there are options out there. So the pros and cons of this are, as I see it, this. The pros, it's cheap for sure in every meaning of the sense. Everybody has it. You've got email, you have a telephone, and we can do that. And there's no learning curve whatsoever. The cons, however, very interesting. There is no central unified storage of information. There is no confirmation of any of the communications. Now, have any of you ever said, oh, well, I sent you that last Thursday. Well, I didn't get it. Oh, well, yeah, can you resend it? And how many days have transpired during that gap there in that communication? Then there is the bandwidth and file size limitation. Yeah, I sent you 3 attachments, each of which were 15 megabytes. No, we can't do that kind of stuff because a lot of systems will reject it if they'll even take it. And the bandwidth, imagine chewing up all of that bandwidth time on your own servers. So the next piece is there are really no backups. Now, you may be lucky and you may be doing some kind of a cloud backup or a tape backup or something like that, but as a team and as a cohesive team, if it's not in place, what happens if something gets lost? And then lastly, there's no security. It's if your system gets hacked, if your people skip out and get angry, there's no security in that. Well, then we have a single point system, which is integrated, a cloud-based, secure file storage, content management, scheduling and tracking, and data collaboration tool. And what does that look like? Well, imagine you took the entire ad hoc system and you actually designed it from the ground up so that it was incredibly robust and you had a tremendous array of tools all integrated into one single program. Now, if you were to Google that, the definition I have here of that single point system of integrated, secured, cloud-based file, all that whole string, drop that into Google, you're going to see these pieces and a whole lot more. So some of the big and popular pieces in software are Box, Huddle, Asana, LeanKit, Quip, Project Place, and Basecamp. Now, we have experience in using 2 of these, Box and Basecamp. Box is kind of the big bruiser on the block. It is tremendously robust. It handles incredibly complex projects, tremendous amounts of data, and that becomes shared data. It is got tracking, it's got scheduling, it's got all kinds of things in it. LeanKit is interesting because that comes from LPD, Lean Project Delivery, and it is specifically designed around the lean practices. And that's kind of an interesting one because it's right down to the push-pull, pull planning, all of that. Really interesting. And then Basecamp, there are a lot of these project systems that are driven around specific industries. So while there are many of them out there, I look at the application inside of the AEC community. these are some good ones. I really, really would encourage you to take a look and see what your needs are. So let's consider what the pros and cons of these are. Well, the pros, it is a complete shared access for the entire team information by all users. And by all users, I mean everybody that you choose to have allowing access to your, let's call it your box session. It tracks all changes, all updates. It is always current. Now, what does that do for us? Well, that eliminates finger pointing because everyone sees, oh, so-and-so posted a new drawing package on such and such date. It eliminates the use of outdated information. And then there's the time wasting of ping pong email. Did you get this? No. Oh, wait, I got to wait 2 days before I get that answer. And then it comes back. No, didn't get it. What was sent? 2 days later. So you can see how insidious that gets to be. This eliminates all of that. So the cons, well, cost. Depending on the system, these can be pretty beefy. The learning curve, getting everybody on the project team to understand how to navigate, how to learn. The actual physical setup of it. Who's hosting this? Typically, it's going to be the owner that handles this. Now, for the owners on this call, I will say that the selection of one of these single point systems, while it may seem a bit daunting on your end and it may be tremendously complex, take a look and weigh the pros and cons of this, because by sinking a little bit of money in, imagine that if you've got 10 or 20 or 100 projects that you're doing simultaneously across the world, all of a sudden being able to integrate so each team has access to all of this right now disparate and disconnected information in an incredibly calculated and cohesive package. Think of the money that you would be saving and the time that you would be saving. So let's talk about over and under communicating. Well, examples of over communicating. I gotta say, these ongoing every single week WebEx presentations, that's great, except that no design work is being done. And the focus is on generation of pretty pictures. So the design team that you're paying great fees to is not really designing, they're your rendering team. That's not the best, perhaps, use of their time. Habitual conference calls without purpose. And I'm all for having functional and good conference calls, but habitual, when people say, what are we going to talk about this week? And then there's that dead air. That is, and everybody rolls their eyes. I can't tell you the last time I heard somebody say, hot damn, I can't wait to get on this conference call. This is going to be so awesome. So, over rendering. Well, really, do we have to render everything? How about we consider the natural evolution of design with, for instance, scaled elevations, and the designer sends out the colors and materials so that you can look at those, and the elevations are tagged and you can see it. I think everybody in this call has, to some degree, an ability to, I'm going to call it, hallucinate of what the design is going to be. And those of you that are on the design side of this, perhaps, are even better at it. Ultimately, yes, I think renderings are a fantastic tool, but this kind of goes back to the first point of every single week, do we have to keep doing that? Because what we're not doing is the critical thinking behind the design, and that's truly what you're paying for. It's not a rendering. That's a tactical piece, and it doesn't get you any farther ahead necessarily. Then the last is meetings without a dedicated time slot for topics and individual team members and disciplines. So here's a little bit of a conflict. I love the idea of the energy and the intellect enabled by cross-fertilization by different team members, different disciplines. But if on a conference call that has 20 people on it and there are 2 representatives from every discipline and the civil engineering starts kicking in and it's 30 minutes, I don't know how many people are going to really convey solid points of view or alternative thinking or things like that. So at what point does that cross-fertilization become uselessness? And I'm going to say this goes back to some things that we've talked about previously, and that is get the right people on at the right time and have their participation there. If let's look at it from the ownership standpoint. Let's say that everybody on that call is based on an hourly fee, and you had to pay for their time for that entire slot, and you heard one discipline talk for 30 minutes while the other 7 disciplines did absolutely nothing, and you had to write that check. And let's say that's $1,000 a meeting. You have a meeting a week. You have a 2-year, 3-year project. How do you like writing that check? Is that really the best use of everybody's time? So I'm interjecting a question. Is there a better way to structure it? Is there a way to create dedicated time slots for topics, stop and start times on these things? Or is it individual team members are on a call for a certain period of time and the PM is then regulating the traffic in and out? I think that may be something to consider. So then that's over-communicating. What about under-communicating? Well, under-communicating is equally as dangerous, and that is not having all team members present, for instance, during the construction document page turn. That would include building department officials. There are many times that we have seen, if there isn't even a page turn, but let's say that we're very radical and we are doing a page turn. Having all team members present is absolutely critical, because if you don't have all the weigh-in, all of the expertise sitting at the table, again, it's gummed up, something waits, something stalls, something isn't communicated. Then the decision makers not being present at key milestones, and I mean by that presentations. Everybody that is a decision maker has to be at those presentations. And we talked about this in the very first slide, identifying those decision makers, and even more so, if number 1 isn't there, who's the number 2 that is authorized to make those final decisions that will not be countermanded or recanted later? Those are really key things to keep your project moving and flowing nicely. Poorly managed meetings which don't resolve issues. How many times have we sat in conference calls and in meetings that hours of discussion, literally hours upon hours of discussion, and nothing ever gets resolved? Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we look at the different meeting types in the next slide. And then uncommunicated expectations. If I don't, or if the project manager, or if the architect, or if the interior designer doesn't communicate what our expectations are, that is to the team members, above, below, and laterally, and across the board, all those communication expectations, if you don't say them, that is planning for disappointment. And I think that's a great recipe for disappointment, is don't bother communicating your expectations. And then the last one is one of my favorites, is the silent type. And that is the brooding consultant that sits there and doesn't say a word and just waits and waits and waits. And this actually can take the form of the passive-aggressive type, or it's months later, I knew that wasn't going to work and you didn't ask me. Well, I think that, again, this goes back to everybody at the table needs to contribute, and it's got to be vocal. You have to be participating. It's not sitting on your laptop, sitting there at your phone. It simply does not work. The 2 key meeting types. Now, there are a lot of different meeting types. There are 2 here that have very specific project application. The first one is the daily check-in or the daily huddle. That is 5 minutes long. That is best for in-house or on-site teams. And what happens in that is you share daily activities and schedules. It's what you're doing today. That is the thing. That is exclusively what is covered in that. I'm handling this. You go around the room and boom, 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 it's done. It's no longer than 5 minutes. Second meeting type is the biweekly or the weekly tactical meeting. And this is, application-wise, is best for team-wide things. Where this starts to get interesting is that this has really 3 parts to it. The first part of this is the lightning round. Oh, lightning round, what the heck is that? Well, that is each person gets 60 seconds. There are 2 to 3 priorities for the week per person, and there's 0 detail in that. You go around the table, you go around the room, and depending on the size, you've burned, let's call it 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes. I know who's doing what, the 2 to 3 priorities that person is working on for the week, and there's no detail. Hang with me here because this gets better. Then there's the progress review. Well, then the next piece is the team previously has to have determined the metrics, the things that they want to measure. What is critical to know on an ongoing basis or at an evolutionary basis that we need to monitor? What are the critical items? It can be cost, it can be rainfall, it can be deliverables, it can be POs, RFIs, all kinds of things. So we want to know the progress related only to those metrics. What are the, as I mentioned, the deliverables, the RFIs, the POs, what's the status of that? So as we look at these, the daily check-in and the daily huddle and the weekly or bi-weekly tactical, do you notice anything that's missing in these? We've got a lightning round, we've got a progress review. How about an agenda? Yep, no agenda until now. So real-time agenda, which is done after the above lightning round, after the above progress review, and that's based on what people are really doing and how the team is really progressing, not what the PM or the leader's best guess 48 hours prior before the meeting, what that was. Oh shoot, I need to have something on the agenda. Let me go ahead and put that out and let's just, we'll roll with it. So what happens is that when you start working real time, that changes things, doesn't it? It allows the meeting to be fluid. It allows it to be spontaneous, and you can't help but stay current and stay relevant. And those are really, really powerful pieces. This doesn't take the place of well, let me rephrase that. The weekly or bi-weekly tactical, I think, could very easily be a great structure for the weekly call-ins. I think that would work really well. Next piece. So the team characteristics that derail communication. Now, this piece I take directly from Pat Lencioni. He is a fantastic author. If you've not had an opportunity to read his work, the piece that I'm going to reference here comes from his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And Lencioni has been a top-selling author for, I don't know, over a decade now. And it's his innovation and his information has absolutely had a profound influence on how we manage our company here at Clear on Black. And I know hundreds and hundreds of other companies. So how Pat Lencioni looks at this is the 5 dysfunctions of a team start with one thing, and that is the absence of trust. The fear of being vulnerable with a team member prevents the team building trust within the team. If you're afraid to share, you're afraid to make a mistake, afraid to do something with your team members, that makes people not trust you because they can tell you're holding back. The next piece is fear of conflict. And this is, I love this term, artificial harmony. The desire to preserve artificial harmony stifles the occurrence of productive ideological debate. Now, I believe that you need to have a really furtive debate. I think that the pros and the cons and the pluses and minuses and the pluses and deltas need to be absolutely vigorously hashed out, because rarely in our design world are things so black and white, which is better, blue or red, which is 6 foot or 11 feet. So when we look at that ideological debate, there has to be a climate of being able to talk about that. And if you're absolutely scared to death about that fear of conflict, then what happens is you tend to preserve what is known as artificial harmony, and it absolutely is just devastating. Then third piece is lack of commitment. Well, lack of commitment creates, when there's a lack of clarity and or the fear of being wrong, it keeps people from making decisions in a timely way or in a definitive way. It's kind of this paralysis of, what if I'm wrong, or what if it's not the right decision, or, well, we could talk about it as a group, and it ends up postponing. So this lack of commitment then triggers an avoidance of accountability, and that is the need to avoid interpersonal discomfort keeps team members from holding each other accountable for their behaviors. And of all these 5 dysfunctions, of all these characteristics that can derail communication, my non-statistical opinion is that this avoidance of accountability is probably the #1 culprit in the derailing of communication. It's never fun to hold people accountable, but what I will say is that in learning how to do this, and it was very, very difficult for us, and certainly me as an owner, it's not great calling people out, but what I realized was it's the manner and way that you call them out. And you can be empowering, you can be humorous, or you can be cruel and nasty and sarcastic, and you're not going to make any friends that way, and you're not going to do very well that way. So I think when you are starting to hold people accountable, that's, again, about managing expectations. So if you're avoiding the accountability, then that triggers inattention to results, because what happens is individual credit starts to become the primary driver for someone, because they realize they don't have anyone that's really on their team that they trust. They're afraid to talk about it. They really aren't going to commit to anything. So their desire for individual credit erodes the focus on the collective success of the team. And I'm going to just one more pitch here for Lencioni. It is wonderfully innovative. I would say that as you take a look at your teams and your companies, see how this filter lays over the top of it. So I'm going to close, and we're going to just talk about the upcoming webinars. And I know that I proclaimed that we were going to cover IP on this call, and I recently had a very fantastic conversation with a gentleman, Darren Klemchuk, and he and I are going to do a webinar in the fall that is entirely based around hospitality intellectual property. Our working title is Design Hygiene, the Case for Staying Clean. And Darren and I are going to talk about a whole range of IP issues as it relates to our industry in hospitality. So as we move into the Q&A session here, I want to just see what kind of questions are popping out. Let's see here. Questions. Okay. Now, if you want, you can type questions. Okay. So what about long-range planning meetings? Well, that is another type of meeting, and that is, and I'm going to reflect back to Lencioni, that is a strategic meeting. And that is, there shouldn't be a time limit in terms of the duration. And that purpose, it's got to be open-ended, and you have to be able to debate, and you have to be able to get resolution on it. And then that open debate, that's how you're going to get resolution with full commitment on everybody's participation. Okay, there's another one here. What if something can't be solved in a meeting? Well, one of the things that we've learned in LPD, Lean Project Delivery, is there's a great term called the parking lot. And things that can't be solved in the moment get put in the parking lot. And basically it's just a whiteboard, and somebody writes that up there, and it's titled parking lot. But if the right people aren't there, if there's a schedule conflict, if something prevents something from being solved, parking lot it. That way there is a subsequent strategic meeting with obviously all the required stakeholders that hash it out with no time limit, whatever it takes to get it solved, then that's how you do it. I would like to thank you all for joining in this series. I've really enjoyed doing this. We've had some really amazing participation from people, and it's been a lot of fun. So I hope this has been valuable to you all, and I'm glad that we're here. And stay tuned for the next one. You will be on the email list, and we're going to wrap for the day. Thanks very much.